when I jumped into politics at 16 years old, there was not a civil war going on in the GOP to the extent that it's going on today. Things have changed. Today, we're going to talk about why and whether we can end the Civil War now. I believe we can, and that is our topic today. Let's get to the show. The election is just around the corner. People are already mailing in their ballots. Early voting will start in a couple weeks. A lot's going on. And the race for Speaker of the Texas House is at an all-time high, with a majority of Republicans in the Texas House saying they oppose him and support David Cook, who has gotten behind a myriad of structural reforms that will significantly change the way the lower chamber, the Texas House, interacts and operates with Republicans, grassroots, conservative groups. We're going to talk about some of those today. But more importantly, we're going to talk about whether or not we can end the Civil War. Now, when my dad ran for state representative in 2006, there certainly were Texas Monthly articles and other outlets that would talk about the strife within the Republican Party. There has always been a more conservative element and a more establishment element. Some call them the White Shoe Boys. Some call them the Chamber of Commerce crowd. Some people call them, the business establishment, the corporate cronies, whatever you want to call them, the rhinos, the lobby. There's an established hierarchy and kind of, let's say, moderate ruling elite, and conservative, a growing voice of conservatives in the Republican Party who have begun to take the party back. Now that battle has always happened. It has been around for a long time. I remember talking to Bill Zedler, who was a state representative in Tarrant County, for those of you who don't know. And I mean, the guy literally helped protest a Hooters that was opening up down the street, and met a bunch of conservative activists who then said, hey, our Republican state representative is a moderate. The guy's name was Kim Breimer, who ultimately became a senator. He was actually trying to run for speaker at the time against Tom Craddock. They were going to run if Republicans took the majority. And Bill Zedler, this little upstart grassroots guy, gets such a big chunk, over 40% of the vote, that Kim was seen as vulnerable, and Tom Craddock was the obvious choice for speaker then. So these battles between establishments and conservatives have always gone on, and to some extent, they never will stop entirely. But what we're in today is not that. What we're in today in the Republican Party of Texas is a civil war. That's what's happening. It's inside the Republican tent. And it is at an all-time high. Even during the Tea Party era, I was running campaigns in 2010. I ran Ken Mercer's campaign. That was the first campaign I ever got to run fully as the operative who was running it for State Board of Education. There were a number of victories that year. David Simpson got elected to the State House against Tommy Merritt and Ken Mercer, a number of other people. State Board, we had a bunch of great conservative victories. Yes, there was establishment forces and there were conservative forces. In 2012 and in 2014, when I started running races, we were running against Republican incumbents, okay? The battle was conservatives versus the moderate establishment types. The difference was that it was an intra-party fight, but it wasn't very fair, to be honest. And what I mean by that is the deck and chips or whatever, everything was stacked against you. So if you were a conservative Republican running against an establishment incumbent Republican who was moderate, likely they had the support of their state senator. Likely they had the support of the comptroller, Susan Combs, of the agriculture commissioners, Todd Staples, of the attorney general at the time, Greg Abbott, of often the governor, Rick Perry, sometimes not, but often, yes, the governor was involved in helping them. So all of your forces. The Republican Party of Texas at the time was not really challenging incumbent Republicans. They were largely cheerleading the wins. So if you look at even that window, even at a time when, yes, a lot of conservatives were organized to try to make the party more conservative, to get the worst liberal Republicans out of the way so we could start governing in a more conservative manner. At that moment in time in 12 and 14 and 16, I don't think I would have described that as a civil war. I would have described that as the friction that has gone on for quite some time. What happened from 2010 to 2023, over 13 years, all of Texas and all of the Republican Party and the legislative offices and the state offices and the county offices and all these areas got increasingly a little more conservative. Now, this is a testimony to the endurance of a lot of conservatives, the enduring spirit, because it showed a willingness to say, hey, we will take a lot of losses and some wins each cycle, but slowly and surely we will get there. And some of them were districts that got more conservative with somebody who wasn't necessarily running as some staunch, ardent conservative fighter. But it was ultimately somebody who was very liberal as a Republican who left or retired and then was replaced by somebody who, instead of being an F, would have been a C or a C plus or a B. And each of these victories over 13 years got the state a little more conservative. The Senate, drastically more conservative. Now, this is a good opportunity to maybe talk about, when I talk about where we could go, the Senate is a good example. So when Dan Patrick became the lieutenant governor, it was the same year that a lot of other conservatives were elected to the Senate, okay? Don Huffines, Bob Hall, Lois Colcourse, Charles Perry. You have a ton of different people at the time that are upgrades from the other districts that they came from. Okay. And so the Senate is increasingly more conservative, and the lieutenant governor is also, of course, more conservative than David Dewhurst. Now, that did not mean that there was never, ever, ever a contested primary from 2014 to 2024 over a decade. We can't say, oh, for 10 years, there's been no conservative pushback to the Senate. No, that's happened at times, sometimes on policy, like constitutional carry, when there was pressure applied to a chamber that didn't seem to want to move that policy, but the lieutenant governor and the senators buckled down and delivered. There was even pressure on the Senate during the impeachment trial because people felt like a lot of the senators weren't clear whether or not they opposed the very botched process by the House. But ultimately, they made a decision and sided with the grassroots. There were even primaries to the most liberal Republicans like Craig Estes or Kel Seliger, who still stood in the way. Now, nobody would look at the Senate over 10 years and say, man, there was a massive civil war going on in the Republican Party in the Texas Senate. No. The point was that the battles or disagreements that were had with that chamber between the Senate and the Republican Party, the Senate and the Attorney General, the Senate and the grassroots activists, the Senate and all these different conservative organizations, the friction only happened on occasion. And on the occasions it happened, disagreements were had, people expressed their concerns or frustrations, and then everyone moved on. And that is how you should operate, in my opinion, is that you should disagree when you disagree, and the next day find more agreement and work on those issues together. But at that same time, while the Senate was getting more conservative and everybody is working together, at times having disagreements, but for the most part, working through these issues, the Texas House is also getting a little more conservative each and every cycle. Many of you helped make that happen. Every single cycle, a little more conservative, a few more seats. The problem in 2023 is that the establishment wing of the GOP, mostly seen as Dade Phelan. It doesn't mean it's only Dade Phelan, but let's say he's the most significant statewide face of that group and wing of the GOP today. That wing decided to try and squelch what had grown to be a significant force in their party. And they didn't perceive it that way. And here's why. Because on the first day of session, only 3 Republicans voted against Dade Phelan. Nate Schatzline, Brian Slayton, and Tony Tinderholt. 3. So if you are Dade and his Cardinals, you're thinking to yourself, we own this chamber. And so in their opinion, and it took hubris to get here where they got, but in their opinion, I believe what they ended up doing was perceiving that they had this massive amount of support from Republican elected officials in their chamber. And so they convinced themselves, we're all fine. We're all on the same team. It's just all those other people. It's all those dirty activists outside. And it's all those Republican chairmen that are telling you what to do. And it's all those county chairs in the SREC. It's the lieutenant governor. It's the attorney general. It's the ag commissioner. It's the governor. Don't let these people tell the Texas House how to operate. And they told they convinced each other, we're all a fraternity. We're together. Those guys are all weird. It's kind of like the Tim Walz thing. They're weird. So they convinced themselves, everybody else is weird, we're the normal ones. And then because of that hubris, they ended up deciding to cut massive deals with Democrats to kill dozens and dozens and dozens of conservative Republican policies. I don't need to go through them all here today. It's not 1, it's not 2, it's not 3. It's well over 50. And those 50 conservative policies not only need to be enacted, should have been enacted over the last decade. There's more that we've even come up with in the last 2 years that other Republican states have enacted that we need to add. Because there's new battlefronts that open up, and conservatives fill the gap when those battlefronts open up. But not often in Texas. And often when we do fill the gap, we fill it up. We fill that gap in 2 or 4 or 6 years after a bunch of other Republican states have. And that's eating away at our state. But there is a way out. And I'm going to talk about that when we come back.
For years, the Chinese Communist government has been buying up land all over the United States. What's worse, the land they're buying is within a disturbingly short distance from our military bases. In this coming season of Exposed, we dive into why our power grid continues to fail, who and what is behind those failures, and how the monster of the Chinese Communist government is behind it. Exposed, Lights Out, a new series by Texas Scorecard. Out now wherever you listen to podcasts.
Ultimately, when House leadership convinced themselves that, and these Cardinals, that we really all are together, what they didn't realize is that a lot of Republicans in the Texas House didn't like the deals that were cut with Democrats, didn't like all the power that was given to the minority party, didn't want to villainize the attorney general and try to, convince the entire state that he's the most corrupt criminal in the state of Texas, which proved to be false. They didn't like that. And Dade and his Cardinals, because of their hubris, didn't even recognize that. So all along, while the session's going on, a lot of these Republicans are just kind of waking up to the fact that this is not what we signed up for. And by the end of the session, what they didn't realize is that a significant of their own caucus had already said, we need something new. And then they had ended up walking a bunch of the incumbents off of a plank, cutting them up and sending them out to a very contested primary where a record number of them lost. So what you have when you look at the 48 Republicans who are supporting David Cook is a conglomeration of Republicans who all don't think that we should operate with the Democrat relationships we've operated with in the past. And they don't think that the Texas House should be at war, at a civil war level conflict with the Attorney General, with the Texas Senate, with the Republican Party of Texas, with grassroots activists, with the governor, with the agriculture commissioner. They don't think that that is a good idea. Now, let's talk about the structural reforms that David Cook has supported. Not all of them, but I'm going to give you some examples. We know the Republican chair issue. He has said that we should have all Republican chairs and a Republican speaker pro tem. This fundamentally sets the relationship status in a more appropriate place, with Republicans leading and governing and ruling and not handing Democrats a bunch of leverage they'll use. That's an obvious one. But there's other things that he's also supported. He has said Republican priorities should actually be considered in the legislature and come forth. Right now you have a war going on in the caucus where Dustin Burrows and Greg Bonin and all these other people don't even want to have Republican priorities. They're mad that Tom Oliverson formed a subcommittee that's actually going to develop additional Republican priorities on top of the Texas GOP priorities, because that would imply that if those priorities don't get voted on, that leadership would have to bend over backwards to kill them. So they're trying to not acknowledge the fact that the Texas GOP priorities exist, where James Frank and David Cook and John Smithy and Tom Oliverson and Shelby Slauson, who all were running for speaker at a time and now have ended their campaigns and backed David Cook, all of them said Republican priorities should be voted on. Do you see how that would change the relationship status between grassroots activists, the Republican Party of Texas, the lieutenant governor, and the Texas House? Just that position alone. Right now, Dan Patrick at the Texas State Convention said, guys, you tell us the priorities, we take your priorities, and we try to move them through the process. Now, the Senate has a lot of other priorities, but it also recognizes what the grassroots have done and try to get their priorities through as well. The grassroots know that. It doesn't mean that the Texas Senate passes every single bill we could ever dream up and want to pass. But I actually think the grassroots conservatives are more reasonable than the Texas House Cardinals want to admit they are. And maybe even perceive them as, right? Because when you're in the middle of a civil war, bullets are flying. It's not really easy to see the other side as reasonable when bullets are flying over your head. Okay? So let's give them maybe a tad bit of charity and say they have a harder time perceiving it right now because of the conflict they're in. But because the Texas Senate is making an effort to move these issues forward, they're acknowledging that the Republican priorities are priorities. That alone goes a long way in setting a better relationship. You also won't have as much of this Senate versus House situation, because right now what happens is the Senate passes a bunch of conservative policy, and it does so early because it knows the Texas House is playing this slow delay game. Another thing, Tom Oliverson articulated this, James Frank articulated this when he announced his campaign, Shelby Slauson, John Smithy and David Cook have all said, we have to move this process forward more quickly. We have to assign committees sooner. We have to get to work sooner. That way it doesn't look like we're playing an intentional delay game. It's not just that it looks that way. They do play an intentional delay game. So if you have a new leadership structure that moves things quicker, it changes the relationship status. It changes the amount of conflict. It significantly decreases the temperature in the room. Structure determines behavior. Structure determines behavior. The Texas House is structurally set up in such a way that if you are a Republican member in the chamber under Dennis Bonnen or Dade Phelan or Joe Straus's leadership, you are set up to be at conflict with the Senate, the Attorney General, the Republican Party of Texas, and all of your activists, the conservative activists in your district. You're set up to be in conflict with them because they're going to tell you to take a 5-day weekend for 6 weeks. And if you vote against taking that 5-day weekend, they will yell and scream at you. It is conform to this structure and be at odds with all these people, or we will try to make you as insignificant as possible. That's what they did. It didn't work. It did work when it comes to killing a bunch of conservative policy. It did work when it comes to them getting what they wanted and keeping the relationship on an okay footing with the Democrat caucus, which is their power base. But it didn't work to keep Republicans together, which makes sense. What Republicans would be united under that situation? Now, it's gotten so bad that the Dade and his Cardinals are not only at war with all of those outside forces. Okay, so rewind a year and a half ago, they could say, well, we're at war with all those forces, but they're all the weird ones, and we're the normal people. Now, a majority of their own Republicans in the chamber are saying, well, we're not with you either. So they have truly been confined to a minority of the Republican caucus and the Democrats. That's all they have. That's where we're at. If we speed the process up, the temperature comes down. If House Republicans recognize the Texas GOP priorities are actual priorities we should try to get to, the temperature comes down. If Republicans are leading, the temperature comes down. If the calendars committee is a little more transparent, the temperature comes down. All of these things greatly change the frequency and severity of the conflicts we have. Now, I'm not telling you that if we get a new speaker and it is a Republican-led structural reform system, that we are in kumbaya, rainbows and sunshine, there's never any conflict. Okay, if you're looking for never any conflict, then don't be in politics. But what I'm telling you is that we won't be in a civil war, which we currently are in. There are members that will vote 80% or 85% of the time in a more conservative way. But the 15% of the time they don't. The 15% of the time they conform to the pressure of leadership are major, major, major battles that pit them at significant odds with their own district. And they have primary opponents. And they have to raise over $1 million to barely try to get reelected. And a lot of them lose. That's where we're at. And so, yeah, Republican members are frustrated. Now, I want to talk about the forces that are trying to keep the Civil War going. Because I truly believe, from a lot of conversations I've had with elected officials on both sides, by the way, of this disagreement, elected officials who are trying to reform things and elected officials who really don't know if they want to reform things. I've talked to operatives, politicians, elected officials, donors, activists, leaders in the Republican Party who like where the Republican Party is going. And I've talked to leaders in the Republican Party who aren't as on board or didn't support Abraham George for chair, right? So I'm trying to figure out where everybody's coming from. And the vast majority of them want to get to a place where we still have natural and normal disagreements, but they're less frequent and they're less severe. I think that's where most people want to get. I think that's where our statewide Republican elected officials want to get. I think it's where the Senate wants to get. And I think it's where a majority of the Republicans in the Texas House want to get. The question is, will 53 and then 76 Republicans ultimately get there? 53 Republicans is what it will take to nominate a different type of leadership in the Texas House, to nominate reform, to nominate David Cook. That's what it would take, 53. And then after 53 would nominate him in the Republican caucus and give him the Republican choice for speaker, make him the Republican choice, there's then a road to 76. There's another 23 people. My current prediction is that we have 87 Republicans in the legislature. So we currently have 86. I think we gain one. We could gain 2 or 3. Okay. But let's just say we're at that 87 number. 86, 87, 88. In that case, in order to elect somebody who's going to change things, They have to get all but 10 Republicans, 11 Republicans. So who doesn't want to end the Civil War? Well, there is a group of Republicans in the Texas House. Right now, I'll put that group's size in the 30 number. Some of them don't want to end the Civil War. Some of them don't think the Civil War will ever end. So they've almost just convinced themselves that, it's all going to be bad every time. So we might as well just keep doing what we're doing. Keep the deals with the Democrats. We keep in power and stay chairman. And who cares? We're going to be at war forever. It's a very depressing perspective, but some of them have that. Some of them want it to end, but they are afraid of the current power structure being really mad at them. And some of the current power structure is just like, I don't want this to be over. We can keep going. So what are some of the things they're doing and saying? I'm just going to give you all this for perspective so you kind of understand what this other side is doing. One of the things they're trying to convince the Republicans of is they're kind of mad. They'll say things like, most of these new guys will ultimately kind of conform. And they won't use the word conform, but they'll say things like, they're not all the fighters you think they are. And what do they mean by that? What they mean by that is, hey, I swear we could mistreat everybody and most of them will ultimately come in line. And we might have like 10 or 12. We're not sure about some of those real fighters, but most of the others over time, you give them a session or two, they'll get in line. And we'll be okay. We can keep governing the way we govern the Texas House. So it's kind of this, hey, if you just stick with us for a while, we promise it'll come back to the norm. Which, by the way, it has been the norm for the last decade. Very much so. So that's one pitch. The other pitch is, a majority of Republicans aren't actually wanting something different. That's the other thing they try to convince themselves of. You'll hear them say things like, well, David Cook only has, high 30s or low 40s. The amount of Republicans who've said that is I bet you almost every one of the people that haven't endorsed David Cook have said that. It's just so often you hear it dropped left and right. Well, they're not even with him. What does that mean? Well, what they're trying to convince themselves of is that really 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 of those people who have said, I want something different, I want reform, I want the structural change, really, they're kind of with us eventually. And they're now trying to recruit a different person to run for speaker other than Dade, because they're convinced that if David Cook and Dade Phelan are in a caucus, then well over 60 Republicans will vote for David Cook because they're ready to move on. They kind of recognize that. I would say there's maybe 12 to 13 people that don't recognize that, but most of them do. And the ones that do recognize it are now basically saying somebody else is going to run. And they're not saying who, but they're saying somebody else will. And it could be Greg Bonnet. It could be, I just don't think it's going to be a Dustin Burrows. It could be Brad Buckley. They're trying to find somebody who they can throw out there who can keep David Cook and this reform model from leading the Texas House. Do some of those people want the Civil War to continue? Yes. Do some of those people just think the Civil War is going to continue regardless of what they do? Yes. Kind of a defeatist mindset. And some of them are just scared of the other people that are currently in power. And so they're just not sure what to do. They don't know whether to go along with that or to say, let's rip the Band-Aid off and try something new. We've been at an increasing level of conflict with everybody else, and maybe something new would change the way our chamber operates in such a way that we'd be at less conflict. That this would by no means be defined as a civil war. Guys, the Civil War has reached such a point that the Republican Speaker of the House, Dade Phelan, is not even spending money right now trying to grow the Republican majority. That's crazy. we have a Republican Speaker of the House that's not trying to expand the amount of Republicans in that chamber. Other Republicans are. I know a lot of Republican state representatives who are donating and raising money and going and block walking and working hard in these districts to try to move Texas to the right. But it's so bad that our sitting Republican speaker won't do that. So this group, they're not all together. There's 40 of them who are not with David Cook. They're not with reforming the Texas House. And this group of 40 are in all sorts of different kind of camps. But ultimately, I wouldn't say that they, if they're in that group, don't want the Civil War to end. But I would say that a number of them don't. They either don't or they're just convinced we're always going to be at war. And they're just trying to keep their power. Which to some extent on like a human nature level makes sense. If you're just convinced we're always going to be at war, you might as well gobble up as much power as you can. It's not good for Texas. It's not good for the people you serve. It's not good for the conservative policy that we need to enact, but it is at like a very base fleshly level where you could easily end up. I am very hopeful and optimistic that we can end the Civil War. And it does not mean that conservative Republicans are not going to keep trying to fight to make Texas more conservative. And this is how I'm going to close this out. It doesn't mean we're all just going to start cheerleading everything that everybody does all the time. That's not what we're talking about here. But every one of us can admit that right now, the Civil War is at a pretty high temperature. It's at a pretty high level. Now, if you are a conservative donor, a conservative activist, a conservative Republican leader, a conservative Republican elected official, just a conservative voter who goes to church and tries to stay somewhat engaged. If you're any of those people, recognize that the reason we are where we're at and possibly in the place where we can end the Civil War is because of all the work you've done to get Texas where we have it today. It's the work that you have done. Now, if enough Republicans decide that they want to govern with Democrats in the Texas House, they can keep their power. They can. If enough Republicans say, you know what, it doesn't matter, 30 or 40 of us will never let these reforms take place. We will do everything we can to stop it. If they do that, then yes, they can keep their power. If they yell and scream and kick and try to get the votes for somebody who will keep the Texas House as much like it currently is, they might be able to keep their power. And if that happens, then they are also signing up for more conflict with the Republican Party of Texas, with conservative groups across the state, with statewide elected officials. That's what they're signing up for. I don't know why they would think that doing that for another 2 years is optimal. And I am increasingly optimistic that they won't ultimately decide to do that. When Republicans come around to changing things significantly and structurally in such a way that we have less conflict, we should rejoice. And we should recognize that. A lot of people have done that I haven't always agreed with. A lot of Republicans who I disagreed with last session significantly have done that, have come out and said, we need to change things because this is not good. And we need to be okay when people do that. That's a good thing. Might some Republicans enough still decide to sell out and go with the Democrats? Yeah, they might. If they do, the question is, what will conservative elected officials in the Texas House do? And I believe that there's a lot of them that are going to fight very hard next session if this uniparty deal gets cut. That's going to be an exciting time. It will not nearly be as exciting as a new Texas House where the Civil War has come way down to the extent that you probably couldn't define it as a civil war anymore. And there's just regular policy disagreements that we have on a Monday, and then we work together on Tuesday, and you disagree on Wednesday, and you work together on Thursday. And that's the way we could operate. But we'd have to structurally reform these things. Structure determines behavior. And right now, the structure of the Texas House is set up in such a way that if you're just a normal Republican, you get elected, you make some promises, you get into that chamber, you're set up to fail. You're set up to fail. And that's all they can pitch to you to keep them in power. Don't worry, we'll stay here. There's enough power to get shared around. We're going to be okay. And you'll feel more important. But yeah, you're going to be at war with all those people. I don't think the war needs to continue. Guys, we do need to keep working to make Texas more red. I like attacking Democrats. I would love for this show to more regularly just talk about the Democrats and all the crazy ideas they have. Conservatives want to do that, but often these moderate Republicans like dive in front of us. They jump in the way. And then this is how I describe like a JC Jatan or a Stephanie Click. We wanted to make the whole session, when I say we, I mean conservatives as a whole, got into the session and said, we're going to make sexualizing kids completely off limits at any and all avenue at any time. And one of the ways to do that was for Tony Tinderholt to step up and say, no dollars from grant programs given out to children's mental health clinics. No dollars can go to a mental health clinic that's sexually transitioning these kids with their mental health care. Okay? We call it social transitioning. It's brainwashing. That's all. And you know what? 11 Republicans voted with the Democrats to keep that money going to those mental health care clinics who are indoctrinating kids with radical transgender ideology. That's what it did. And some of these Dade-Phelan Cardinals still to this day will tell other Republicans in meetings, yeah, Tony Tinderholt just set all those guys up on some show vote. They call it a show vote. That's how they degrade this policy. What they mean by that is that this isn't real. It's just a show so that you can say that Stephanie Click and JC Jatan are supporting the sexualization of children. But here's the problem. That amendment is real policy that if it gets voted in, will really stop those dollars from going to those mental health care clinics. And there will now really be a financial incentive for mental health care clinics in Texas to stop this sick transitioning, this sick brainwashing they're doing to kids. It's real. And when Stephanie Click and JC Jatan vote with Democrats on that, they are jumping in the way of Democrats, right? Money that would get used to tell Texans these Democrats are sexually transitioning your kids and want to transition your kids with taxpayer dollars, which is what Colin Allred wants to do, by the way. You'd love to just talk about how Democrats want to do this, but when Stephanie Click and JC Jatan jump in front, they take the bullets for these Democrats. It's very frustrating. And I will tell you, a lot of the people that don't want to change right now, they don't believe me when I say that. Like, they do not believe that there's this genuine desire to see this policy enacted. They've convinced themselves that this is all show, that conservatives just want to fight them. I know many of you, and you want to actually see these policies enacted. Colin Allred, by the way, is not going to beat Ted Cruz, in my opinion, but he is closer than people would like to see him in the polls. And again, it just continues to reiterate the point that I keep trying to make, which is we need to focus as much as we can on making Texas more red and more conservative every single day. The Civil War ending would be very helpful in that, but it will only happen with structurally reforming this lower chamber that is the bottleneck to all of these conservative wins, that Governor Abbott would sign into law gladly, and that the Texas Senate works very hard to pass. From now till Election Day, I know everyone's going to spend a lot of time making sure Republicans win, and you should. Every single one of y'all. Do not take this election for granted. Do not assume that every person in your life that is a right-of-center Texan is engaged. Don't do it. Don't make that assumption. It's dangerous. There's people in my church that I know have literally registered to vote in the last year. And they probably plan to vote, but I'm going to make sure they do by encouraging them to. And you have to think that way. To protect our state, to preserve what we have. But my final message is that the Civil War can come to an end. It might come to an end. That doesn't mean kumbaya, but that does mean a much, much better environment for everybody. I hope and pray that enough Republicans in the Texas House recognize that and are willing to make the right decision to help us get there. May God bless you, and may God bless Texas.
Do you want to get your news from people who share your values? Texas Scorecard, real news for real Texans.